Hello, and welcome to yet another guide. Today, we are covering tanking. While this is not a guide on how to maximize efficiency of each and every run and class, we are going to look into some handy, transferable skills and ideas about tanking to help make your run smoother. While I will touch briefly upon mechanical facts, a large amount of my advice are based on half a decade's worth of tanking experience in Final Fantasy XIV. We will be talking briefly about the 4 tanking jobs, before talking about Emnity, defensive cooldowns, dungeon tanking, boss tanking, and then finally about tanking in raids. We will not be covering instance-specific ideas and mechanics, but rather your tanking tools as a whole. This guide does assume that you have knowledge about how to queue for dungeons, and that you know the difference between dungeons, trials, hard trials, 8-man raids, and 24-man raids, all of which unlock at different points of the game. So without further ado, let's get into it. Final Fantasy XIV currently have 2 different base classes and 4 different tank jobs. The 2 base classes are Marauder, which turns into Warrior, and Gladiator, which turns into the Paladin. Paladins specialize in part-wide damage mitigation and support. Dark Knights specialize in single target damage mitigation and sustain. The Warrior forms a formidable defensive wall with defensive skills, high health pools, and monstrous sustain, while the Gunbreakers take a bit from the other 3 as a kind of jack of all trades. Though it depends heavily on who you ask, personally I would say that your choice of tank won't have a major impact, as the game is balanced around making all of them viable, and, in an optimal situation, all tanks do roughly the same amount of damage, with some pulling ahead only slightly. At the end of the day, skill and comfort outweighs class kits 9 times out of 10. Emnity, which you might also know as hate or aggro, is the factor that decides which party member the enemy will focus with auto attacks, tank busters, and a majority of its other mechanics. Each tank has a special, toggleable ability typically referred to as their tank stance, namely Shield for Paladins, Grit for Dark Knights, Defiance for Warriors, and Royal Guard for Gunbreaker, all of which gives you a massive boost to Emnity generation, which for other classes is typically a 1-to-1 scale for damage and healing, and a 2-for-1 scale for overhealing. However, your ratio is much higher. As long as your tank stance is toggled on and you're attacking the foe, you should only ever lose aggro to other tanks. Additionally, Provoke is a special off-global cooldown available to all tanks. In essence, it boosts your Emnity count to match the highest holder in the instance, then adding another +1. If you for some reason need to do a tank swap, it is common practice to ready your hardest hitting ability and use it right after Provoke to establish Emnity. Defensive cooldowns are, for the most part, off-global cooldown, and is a bread and butter of your defensive lineup. For the sake of brevity, I refer to both mitigation and sustainabilities as defensive cooldowns. Available to all tanks are Rampart, which is a medium-length cooldown that reduces incoming damage by 20% for 20 seconds. Reprisal, which is a shorter recharge cooldown which reduces damage dealt by nearby enemies by 10% for 10 seconds. Finally, Arm's Reach, a long recharge cooldown that is also available to melee and ranged DPS, which renders you immune to most knockbacks for 6 seconds, and any enemies who basic attack you during this duration are slowed by 20% for 15 seconds. Additionally, each class has a plethora of weaker and stronger cooldowns of various recharge time. While it takes some knowing the pace of the fight, ideally you want to group up cooldowns to be used on rotation at various points during the fight, either ahead of tank busters or larger pulls. This is commonly referred to as a cooldown rotation. Situations in which you want to be the most vigilant about using cooldowns is situations where you maintain aggro on 4 or more enemies, as this is a threshold where natural health regens, and natural mitigation can no longer keep up with the damage. Furthermore, most bosses have built-in tank busters, which you also want to mitigate. After maintaining the highest Emnity, your main task is to make sure the enemies are standing somewhere convenient for the party to damage. In dungeons or other situations when you pull several enemies, this generally means grouping them up to set them up for the DPS's AoE rotations to achieve as much and quick damage as possible. While this is easily done with some maneuvering while pulling melee-based mobs, ranged enemies will only move when you move out of their range or when you break their line of sight. The easiest way to deal with this is to either break line of sight or to pull every other enemy onto the ranged enemy. In a very large majority of boss fights, bosses lack any sort of reliable side or back-faced conal attacks, but several of them have frontal cleaves and conal attacks, so you should endeavor to face the boss away from your party when possible. Tanking dungeons is the bread and butter for most tank players, and potentially where you have the most responsibilities. Not only do you lead the party through the dungeon, but you also have to keep enmity on the enemies going through. For the most part, this is not too scary. As long as you have your tank stance toggled on, more or less any attack will generate enough enmity to complete the ladder, while a general sense of pace and direction will check up the former. If at all uncertain about aggro, it is fine to default to your area of effect attacks and combos. Typically, dungeons feature 4 groups of enemies on each stretch between bosses. These groups typically range between 2 and 4 combatants. Most newer dungeons have some sort of stoppage every second group, which means that if you feel confident, you can do 2 big pulls between each boss. If you're pulling one in one group, make sure to use a defensive cooldown when fighting 4 enemies or more, then save the rest of your cooldowns for hard-hitting boss abilities. If you do large pulls, these are suddenly the most deadly thing in the dungeon, and you want to put your cooldown rotation to good use here, and only use minor cooldowns on bosses, which are now the minor threats more often than not. Ever since 4.0 Stormblood, parrying and blocking is no longer dependent on enemy position, so say for grouping up your enemies in a way that lets your party hit all of them, you won't have to worry about being hit in the back. As a side note, a lot of the more experienced players and parties prefer larger pulls, as it can shave off a couple of seconds of a dungeon, but rest assured, you are not obligated to do so. Pull what you feel comfortable with. It might irk some, but if they leave, their void will typically be filled faster than they can enter a new dungeon, and if they try to kick you, you can get into a new instant almost instantly more often than not. Your comfort matters. While tanking bosses is normally a part of most dungeons, there are a couple of things to note. First and foremost, the fact that most bosses has a frontal AoE ability or an attack that will hurt any other party member standing there. While these will vary in size, you should take steps to tank the enemy facing away from the party. Furthermore, melee DPS have abilities that require them to hit from a certain position, like flanks and back, and for this reason, you should avoid turning the boss unless strictly necessary, as when dodging AoE attacks. Lastly, as I mentioned before, most bosses have occasional attacks that will hit you for heavy damage. Depending on the kind of pulls you have been doing, you may or may not have certain defensive cooldowns available, but it is always a good idea to mitigate the heavy damage instances in the ways you can. Finally, there's raid and trial tanking, which differs depending on whether it is an 8-man duty or a 24-man duty. In the 8-man duties, there will be 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS more often than not. Most of these fights has one tank hold Emnity on the main boss, while another tank handles incoming adds. This is typically agreed upon before combat starts, and the role of main tank is often assumed by the person that first turns on their tank stance. Typically, the off tanks tend to turn off their tank stance until they need to take care of an ad, though I would not recommend doing this even if it is for the purpose of easier enmity management. Instead, if the enmity gap gets too narrow, the off tank should use the off global cooldown tank roll action Shirk on the main tank, which will transfer 25% of your total enmity onto the target, which, when used on another tank, will decrease your enmity by 25% and increase theirs by 25%. This means that if you shirk while you both have 100 enmity, you will now have 75 enmity while they have 125, a difference of 50. This way, you ensure that even if the main tank dies, you will be able to pick up enmity on the boss before it starts killing your party. On the flip side, 24-man duties work with 3 8-man alliances, each with 1 tank, 2 healers, and 5 DPS. These typically features both regular enemy pulls and big boss battles. Many of these battles will have 1 boss for each alliance, but the majority will only feature 1 boss with the same principle, as the raids. The main tank tanks the boss, while the off tanks take care of any adds. However, here you will not be able to shirk the other tanks. However, shirk is still invaluable. Simply shirk one of your other party members if you feel yourself fighting for enmity with the other tank. This might seem counterintuitive, however, you will transfer 25% of your enmity to a party member, which will gain 25%. However, the main tank gains or loses nothing. So in the same scenario as before, both you and the main tank have 100 enmity. You shirk your DPS. Now the main tank has 100 enmity, you have 75, and the DPS should have somewhere between 25 and 30. Emnity stays where it has to, and you ensure that if the main tank dies, you can pick up the boss before it starts killing the alliances. And that is it for now. Hopefully, you now understand tanking a little bit better. If you found this video helpful and would like more, remember to like and subscribe, and feel free to leave any thoughts or questions in the comment section down below. As always, I hope you have a great day and a great week. Have a nice one!